Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being at this presentation of writing a dual timeline story. My name is Alexandria Faulkenbury, and my book is Somewhere Past the End. It came out in May of 2025, and it is a dual timeline, which is why I'm here talking to you. I wanted to start by mentioning that I am not any kind of super dual timeline expert. I wrote a dual timeline, and so I'm happy to talk about it. But instead of this being sort of a prescriptive presentation where I just tell you what to do, I instead thought I would look at some of the advice that I've seen around the internet on writing a dual timeline story and then say, whether I use that advice, whether it worked for me, whether it worked for my story, and along the way, give you a few little tips that I picked up in the process of writing and querying and publishing a dual timeline novel. So I figured I'd start with a little bit about my story. Somewhere past the end, I wrote this story because I was a story I always wanted to tell about a cult. I always heard the phrase, write the book you want to read, and I enjoy reading stories about cults. So that's what this book focuses on. It follows Alice, who is a young woman who has been raised in a cult called the Collective, and she has become disenchanted with the cult and has decided to leave. And on the day that she is making her grand escape, that is happens to be the same day that the cult leader has set aside as his sort of doomsday prophecy. And so, right as she's about to escape, something happens, and many of the cult members disappear, and she's kind of left in the aftermath of this mysterious disappearance. And she has to figure out how she's going to move forward in the wake of the loss of her family and the home that she's known her whole life. So that's the basic story. As you might hear in my description, I really only talk about Alice, and yet, as you'll see on the screen, my story is not only dual timeline, it is also dual POV. But I didn't start out that way, and it didn't start out as a dual timeline story either. It started out just as Alice experiencing this profound loss, a loss that she thought she wanted, but then when it actually happens, she's not so sure, and what she does and how she moves forward. That's how it started. But I very quickly realized that in order to sell the idea that Alice is trying to leave this cult where she's been raised in her whole life, I first had to make it real, and I had to make it a place that somebody would believe existed and believe that people joined, that Alice's family has been in this cult since her birth. And I found it tricky to do that with just Alice's perspective because she's in the wake of this great loss and she's trying to move forward. And so that's when I had the idea that a dual timeline might serve well because we need to know how this cult came about and how Alice's family found themselves in it. And so that's when I added in the perspective of Teresa, who is Alice's mom, and we get to see her journey into coming into the cult alongside of Alice's journey of figuring out what to do now that everything has imploded. And I came to that realization pretty early on that it needed the second perspective and the second timeline. But what I didn't do is look up any advice. I didn't look up what to do for writing a dual timeline. I just wrote. And then I came to the querying and editing phase, or the editing phase, and then the querying phase, and realized that there were a lot of things I hadn't really noticed. Some things I'd done without knowing that I was supposed to do them, and some things I totally ignored. And even when I found the advice, I didn't necessarily use it. So that's what I kind of want to do in this presentation is talk you through some of that advice I saw or some of the feedback I received from agents and editors when I was querying this novel and how that helped shape the story and how it can hopefully help you shape your own story. So let's dive right into some of that advice. The first one was that every timeline needs its own arc. And I would say very much, you can't really see it because my video is covering it, I see, but it says yes, a big yes to that. This is something I think you know in your bones just as a reader, even before you sat down to write a dual timeline story, because everyone's had that experience of reading a book where there's two timelines and you're really only invested in one. And when you get to the timeline you're not that interested in, you want to just read quickly so you can get to the good stuff. And as a writer, you never want that. You never want your reader to be like skimming or skipping over whole sections of your book because you put all the sections there for a reason, right? So, in order to do that, each timeline needs to have its own interesting arc. You need to have your characters in each arc need to have their own wants and desires, their own obstacles, their own stakes. And that was something that I had to kind of adjust a little bit because Alice's story with the disappearing cult members has a lot more sort of natural pizzazz. There's a lot more happening there. Teresa's story is a little quieter because it's the backstory, the build up to how this cult happened. And some of my early feedback was, I'm not really that interested in Teresa's story. It's kind of boring compared to Alice's. I really just want to get back to Alice's perspective. And of course, you don't want to hear that as a writer. So that was something I had to do, think about, go back and say, okay, how can I make Teresa's story more interesting, more propulsive, and give her narrative something that people want to latch onto? And it involved, unfortunately, a lot of the killing my darlings. I chopped out tons of stuff that I'd put in for Teresa that was very vital to me for figuring her out as a character, but I realized eventually wasn't quite necessary to make her story move forward. Um, and I put The Great Believers here because I think this is a book, I have a copy here, that does this really well, that has each character, each timeline has a very clear arc. It has very clear stakes and very clear objectives for its characters, despite the fact that the stories are woven together. So in The Great Believers, we follow Yale in the 80s, and he is navigating the AIDS crisis. A lot of his friends and relatives are getting sick, and they're still not quite sure exactly what to do about it, and the treatments are still uncertain. And so he's navigating all of that in the 80s, right after the death of one of his good friends. And that good friend's little sister, Fiona, she is the protagonist of the second timeline. In her timeline, she has traveled to Paris to find her estranged daughter and figure out if she's okay and try to repair their relationship. So as you can see, we have like, even though these timelines are connected by their shared past, they have totally different objectives and aims in their stories so that you feel invested in both sides of the story. You want to know if Fiona's going to find her daughter. You want to know if Yale's going to get sick, and if so, what's going to happen to him. So each side of the timeline needs to feel as urgent as the other one. And the second piece of advice that I see a lot is kind of tied to this, and it is that each timeline needs its own strong characters to kind of help hold up that arc. And I would again would say a resounding yes to this. I know you're probably like, when are you going to get to any advice you disagree with? But I promise there is some. But one way that there's a lot of different ways that you can make sure your timeline has these strong characters necessary to uphold their arc. What I found tricky in my story is that I wrote them, again, without any advice, without any research on what would work best. I wrote both of my perspectives in first person. So Teresa's point of view is first person, and so is Alice's. And that got a little tricky when I started getting feedback because readers were telling me they sound the same. They sound like the same person. Even though you're telling me who's talking, I have a hard time differentiating what's happening in their stories. So that was something I had to go back and sit with a little bit. And some of the ways that I helped shore that up was through a unique voice for each character. And that came down to me keeping a journal and looking at things like, okay, Alice and Teresa have very different experiences and relationships with their mothers. So how do they reference their mother? Do they call them mom? Do they say mother? Do they refer to their moms affectionately? There's a lot of themes of motherhood in this story, so I really wanted to hone in on how each character thinks about motherhood and how she sees motherhood and how that comes out in the language she uses to speak about motherhood. So I made sure, and they have different experiences, so I wanted to make sure their language was different. Other small things, for example, Teresa meets the leader of their cult, Brother Richmond, when there isn't a cult, and he's just a guy. And so she meets him as rich, and he stays rich throughout the entire book to her. Alice, on the other hand, is raised in this cult with Rich as the leader. So she always references him as Brother Richmond. That's how she's always known him. That's how she's always going to reference him. So little things like that to figure out what are the unique ways that your character speaks and thinks. Alice is a little bit of a loose cannon. Teresa is much more straight-laced. She's not going to swear. She's not going to use a lot of colorful language, whereas Alice has a little bit more because she's trying to push against and break through those boundaries of the cult, whereas Teresa very much wants to stay inside of them. So finding those little unique ways that your character speaks and talks is one way that you can establish unique and strong characters in each timeline. Point of view is another. Of course, for me, I had two points of view. I had Teresa and I have Alice's. So that naturally gives us sort of a different viewpoint into each timeline. But you might only have a single point of view. You might only have a single protagonist, in which case I think Broken Country, I didn't put the picture of the book on here, I don't think, is a great example of that because you have one single protagonist in that story, but she is speaking across time. You get chapters of her when she's very young. She has her whole life ahead of her. She's in love. She's about to go to university. And then you have chapters of her where she feels like her life is over. She's a grieving mother. Her marriage is in trouble. She's attending a trial for murder. So she's obviously going to look at the world and process the world much differently as a young 17-year-old with who's in love versus a grieving mother. So even if you only have one single character, the way that they look at the world, the way that they process the world around them, and the way that they speak about the world around them can be very unique to where that character is in their time of life. And then another thing I used because I did have two POVs and I decided to write them both in first person, which again, you might see advice about that to not do it, to have one in first person, one in third person, or have them both in third person. And I totally understand that. I had written mine in first person, and once I had written Teresa's point of view in first person, it felt like it needed to stay that way for me. And again, a lot of these tips and ideas come back to what works for your story. And the story I was telling was Teresa was looking back on her life and how did it get to this point. And so for me, it didn't make sense to tell it in third person. It felt like it needed to be first person to have those sort of visceral reactions to her memories. And then Alice, who is our main protagonist, is the one moving the story forward. So I also felt her story needed to be in first person. So I was trying to find all these different ways to differentiate them when I was hearing they were the same. So I ended up using tense. So Alice is moving our story forward. She is everything that's happening to her has yet to happen. So her story is told in present tense. Teresa is reflecting on her life up into this point, up into the disappearance. So her chapters are told in past tense. And I also think that helps get into the mindset of the character too, because like I said, Teresa's looking back. So talking about what happened. Alice is on the verge of the unknown. So everything feels a little more urgent and a little more tense because she doesn't have the benefit of hindsight yet. So I felt playing with those different tenses helped in that regard as well. Okay, so we want to have a unique arc in each timeline, and those unique arcs need strong characters to hold them up. What else have we got? We need a link between the timelines, obviously. In my story, Teresa and Alice are mother and daughter. So there's a very clear link there, and they're in the same place, they're in the same cult. But there are lots of ways you can find these links. There's plenty of dual timeline stories where the characters never meet each other, so they don't have to be connected in that way. So I would say, yes, you do need a link between your timelines, and that was something that I did do right from the start. So some different ways you can find that link. Family, as I mentioned, Teresa and Alice are mother and daughter. Place, you might use, in my story, it takes place in the same place, but you might have, this happens a lot in sort of thrillers or suspense novels where someone's investigating something that happened a long time ago. So they might come back to the house where a murder took place. And the past timeline might be the actual crime, and the present timeline might be investigating it, 50 years later. So those two characters are never going to meet each other, but the place is what's connecting them. You could have an object that's connecting people or a theme. And I stuck two books on here that I thought play with object and theme well. So The Lost Apothecary really dives into the object. The main character in the current timeline finds a small apothecary bottle, and that sends her sort of on an investigation to figure out where this bottle came from, whose it was, and what it was used for. And so then we also get the past timeline of the apothecary, the woman who was using these bottles and what she was doing. And that's the way those two storylines are connected. But you can also use theme to connect your storylines. Maggie O'Farrell's The Hand That First Held Mine is a great example of this. There is a tangible connection between the stories, but you do not get to know that connection until very close to the end of the story. So for most of the story, they feel disconnected. However, both storylines, both timelines center women who are struggling with motherhood and love and relationships. So those kinds of themes of how do we proceed in these relationships? How do we navigate motherhood when we feel unprepared for it? Those themes connect the stories together long before we find out the actual tangible connection between the two timelines. So again, it's kind of like pick your poison, you get to choose. Maybe you connect all of them. Maybe there's a family, place, object, and theme connection. And then Holy Grail, congratulations. Or maybe you just choose one. Or maybe you have a lot of the same connections, but one of them is most prevalent. So in my story, they're in the same place. They have a lot of the same themes. There's a lot of mirroring happening in my timelines. But the family connection is the first and foremost and the most highlighted in the story. The fact that Teresa and Alice are mother and daughter, and they're kind of showing two sides of the same coin, wanting to be in a cult and wanting to be out of a cult. Because that's what I was really interested in exploring, the psychology that brings somebody into a cult and makes them want to um, devote their whole life and talent and time to one person or organization. And then the flip side, what makes somebody wake up one day and realize, I've made a grave mistake. And so I thought exploring the two sides of that coin through a mother and daughter would be an interesting way to do it. But that was just what I wanted to do. You've got to figure out what you want to do in your own story. Using time and place markers. You'll notice I put a yes and a no for this one because what's okay. So what I did is I delineated between the chapters. Let's see if I go hold this up just by their name. So if it's a Teresa chapter, it's going to start off saying it's Teresa. If it's an Alice chapter, it's going to start off saying it's Alice. And then I also alternated each chapter. However, after I got into the querying process, I heard people saying, hey, you gotta give a timestamp. You have to tell us where we are. You have to ground us in time and place, or your reader's gonna get confused. And so I tried it. I tried to go back in, and when I was writing, I had a vague sense that Teresa's storyline was happening in the 80s and Alice's was happening more contemporary. So I tried to pin down exact years and put those years on the chapters underneath the names, and I just found it didn't work for my story because the time and place of the story wasn't central to the story I was trying to tell. I wanted it to even feel a little bit timeless. I didn't want readers to say, oh, well, she was in the 80s in the middle of nowhere. No wonder she fell for a cult. I wanted instead it to feel like it could happen sort of anytime, any place, and that this is just one woman's story and it wasn't so pinned down to a particular instance. And so I eventually took those off and decided to leave them off and just use the name markers. However, you might have a story that really needs those time and place markers. Again, it's completely up to you. You got to decide what works the best for your story. I even had people tell me, like, oh, I could sell this better if you did XYZ. And I ultimately decided that's not what I wanted to do. And you have to make that choice and you have to kind of weigh the pros and cons between, okay, do I want it to sell, but in a way that I didn't intend, or do I want to keep it as I wish and take my chances? And I feel like all of writing is kind of finding that balance, right? Figuring out what are you being too precious about, what are your blind spots that you can't see, and what are the things that are really the heart and core of your story that can't be changed. So you have to figure that out for yourself. But I did want to highlight a couple of books that play differently with this idea of using a time and date stamp. Broken Country, which I already spoke about with the perspective and time, she uses different things throughout the whole book. So in some chapters, you get the month, the year, exactly where they are in the courthouse, and the town they are in England. In other chapters, all you get is before 1955. That's how one chapter starts. So she plays around with how much information she wants to give you. And I'm sure that's very intentional to make you feel like you need to know the exact time and place this character is for some part of the plot or some part of the character development. And then there are those chapters where you don't need to know that much specifics, and the other parts of the story are what are going to carry you through that chapter. So she uses both throughout the whole story, and that is another choice you can make. You don't have to stick to one sort of set pattern. The God of the Woods does a little bit more similar to what I did, which is where she uses a name and then just a year. She does add the year, and not just the name. But I think in her story, it's much more important to have that year because she's looking at two cases of missing children, one that happened in one year and one that happened in another year. And so, and how those cases overlap and what could be uncovered by looking back and looking forward. So, in a case like that, it's definitely important to have those years. So it depends on the kind of story you're telling and what you want to achieve with that story, and what giving those time and place markers, what is that going to help your reader with? Is it going to confuse them to have no markers? Is it going to help them set up a timeline for when these cases or crimes or situations happened? Or is it just because you were told you should do it? You know, you have to decide which one of those makes the most sense for your story. So, oh, my video is covering this one, I see. I'll try to move it down a little. There we go. So keep timelines woven together when drafting. This was a piece of advice that I saw that I thought, whoa, no way. That is one I will say no to because that did not work for me. I actually saw this advice framed as you need to keep your timelines woven together when you're drafting because if you don't, it's going to be too hard to keep track of them, and only really skilled writers can do that. And I felt the exact opposite way. I felt like, no, 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 you need to be really skilled to keep those timelines woven together. Some people will use spreadsheets, will use scene cards, and lay everything out. And that just didn't really work for me. I tried writing them together. And I think because I was writing two timelines, both in first person POV, but one in past tense, one in present tense, I was a total disaster when I tried to write them linearly and keep them woven together as I wrote. I was switching tenses, I was messing up whose head am I supposed to be in? Oh wait, no, she doesn't say that. She doesn't think that. It drove me crazy. So instead, what I did is I wrote them separately. I wrote all of Teresa's perspective, and then I wrote all of Alice's perspective, and then I wove them together. And one of the benefits of that for me, for writing them separately and then sticking them together, was that it was very easy to pick up a scene and move it. So if I decided, oh, actually, I want this reveal from Alice to happen a little earlier, I could easily move it outside of where I had put it without disrupting the flow because I hadn't made it flow to begin with. Finding those connections and building the flow between chapters was something I did sort of towards the very end. The first thing I did was write one timeline, write a second timeline, lay them together in what I thought order they should be, and then realize actually no. So then I did some Tetris, moved them around. And then when they were in the exact order I wanted them to be, then I went back and I saw, okay, how can I find those little connections? How can I pull this chapter into this chapter in an interesting way so that people want to keep turning the pages? But again, you might be different than me. You might find weaving them together as you write to be easier, and you might find it to be better. At the end of the day, you're just going to have to try one and see how it goes. And if it doesn't go great, you can always switch. Because that's the great thing with writing, right? We can always change our minds. Um, so that was keeping timelines together. Again, my screen is covering here. Don't rehash the same scene over and over again. That is one you see a lot, especially when you're talking about writing a dual timeline. And I would say yes on that as well. Because your reader gets bored, right? And you have to give a different perspective if you're going to cover the same scene. And this is something again I found out the hard way. I've had readers tell me like, "Hey, I'm bored. We already heard this from Teresa. Why do we need to hear it again from Alice?" And so I had to find ways to make that not happen because the temptation is that, oh, well, this same scene plays out so differently from her mind than it does from Teresa's mind. So I need to show it twice so you can see the differences. But if you keep it too similar, then again, readers are going to get bored. So one way that I sort of retooled this in my edits was to put them in different places in the same scene. So there's one scene where Teresa and her husband are talking, and then their leader, Brother Richmond, comes to the door, and it's kind of an intense scene. And Alice is there at the beginning, and then she goes to her bedroom. And while she's in her bedroom, one of her friends comes to her window and they have a conversation. So when I wrote those scenes in the two timelines, I wrote Teresa. She's talking to Alice. They're having an exchange. She sends Alice to her bedroom, and then she has the tense exchange with Brother Richmond. She has the panic, the frantic worry, and Alice isn't there. When we get to Alice's perspective much later in the book, and she's remembering this time, she's remembering this event, we don't get all of the tension that Teresa had with Brother Richmond. We get what happened to Alice in her bedroom when she was talking to her friend at the window. And so then the reader can put those two things together as, okay, this is the same scene, but we're looking at it in a different window. So we're not just telling the same story again with like slightly different thought bubbles. We're looking at it we're looking at it in a window in one scene, and we're looking at it through the front door in the other timeline. So I hope that helps. I did put the everlasting here because if you have a time travel story like the everlasting is, then this advice is going to be a little different because the everlasting, one of the great things about that story is that so many chapters start off in the exact same spot, rehashing the exact same scene. And I can even remember it because it started the same way so many times. It was something like several years after the war, I was in my office or something like that. A lot of chapters start that way. But because we know this is a time travel scene, we as the reader know, okay, this book involves time travel. He's repeating the same scene over again. He's in a new sort of time stream. And we know automatically as readers that we need to look for those subtle differences that tell us they're in a different time stream. So if you're doing a time travel book, you might want to rehash the same scene over and over again from the exact same perspective, but weave in those little tiny subtle differences that your reader is going to know to look for, is going to know, hey, we have some time travel here, so I need to look for where the slip up happens. That is also a great book. All the books that I've mentioned today are wonderful, and I really enjoy them. And if you would like a good masterclass in dual timelines, I would definitely read all of these books that I've mentioned because they all do it really, really well and probably much better than me. So read those books as well. And you can find me on a lot of places because that's the end of our presentation. So you can find me on Instagram at AM Faulkenbury. You can find me on Substack also, where I have a occasional newsletter called Not Writing if you'd like to get occasional updates or insights from me. And then you can also find me on my website, alexandriafaulkenbury.com. Once again, my book is Somewhere Past the End. You can find it wherever books are sold in paperback, hardback, or ebook. I would love it if you read it and you want to talk to me about how you think the dual timeline went. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did you find something interesting that you might want to use in your own writing? Whatever the case, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have you read it. It was so much fun to write, even though dual timelines can be a pain in the neck at the end of the day. They're a lot of fun. So thank you so much for attending this presentation. I hope it was helpful and happy writing to all of you.